why would you want to audit an algorithmic system? When we use the word audit, it basically means trying to uncover the ways in which it works. That is effectively a form of systems analysis. But in particular, we're interested in actors that are not as explicitly working. So the idea is that we have some kind of an algorithm, usually an algorithm that is aiming to perform a social function or an organizational function, and we want to know how well it is doing that. In particular, we're interested in algorithms that operate in complex, large-scale socio-technical systems. And often it is difficult to understand whether the algorithm is operating as it is intended to operate within that complex environment, or alternatively, what the intention actually is of that algorithm when it is not explicit. And so the motivating problem here is, how do we evaluate systems that we can't directly inspect? And that is within this larger context of whether we should have more direct access to what happens within those algorithms. But setting that aside, given that the reality of the situation is that we can never have perfect information about this, and often we have very restricted information about the internals of these systems, how can we figure out how they may or may not be working? We can look at a number of examples of people that have done this over time. Probably one of the more influential ones is some work that was done largely by ProPublica and journalists who were looking at data around the Compass system, which is a sentencing tool that is what was and still is widely used in the court system in the United States. And so when you look at that, you can look at, in this case, the intention of it was far more explicit, but you can look at both the system itself and the recommendations it makes, and then how those are being implemented by the courts. And that can help you to understand a little bit about what's happening internally. This kind of gives us a tension between the issue of, this is and I'll talk a little bit about this elsewhere, something of a forensic investigation. This is detective work. This is trying to find out something that may in some cases be adversarial. You're trying to find out what is being covered up, either because of there's a number of reasons someone might want to cover up the way a system operates. For example, for Google, their claim is twofold. One is that it's a trade secret, right? If you knew just how the Google algorithm worked, you could build a competitor, and you would have an unfair advantage because the magic sauce of the Google search engine is its secret algorithm that shifts over time. And the second piece of that is that if you knew how the algorithm worked, you could then create the perfect website that would always be ranked number one, because if everyone knew what the formula was, you could solve for popularity. Setting aside the validity of these claims, these arguments for obscurity, we can at least understand why it may be difficult to unseat these as a pretty standard thing. Folks are generally reluctant to share the ways in which their algorithmic systems work. And that leaves us as researchers trying to figure this out, either because we need to know for the purposes of ensuring that they are fair, they are just, that they do what they say they are doing, or for some other reason. We are left with a set of methods that are sometimes all gathered under this rubric of algorithmic audits. Now, there are maybe a number of different kinds or dimensions in which we could split up the auditing process. There are internal versus external audits. Now, we're going to be focused mostly on the external audits, but there is the possibility of, there are claims that these already exist, and there are the possibilities at least of engaging in internal audits. And these are maybe company-led audits where someone has a role of ensuring the fairness of internal systems and is put in the place of doing internal inspections of how those work. And so that might be the form of, if you were working for a company in a role that required either regulatory compliance, or you were engaging in this because the company had hired you to ensure that their systems had an ethical basis, then you might engage in this internal audit. You may also have kind of at the cusp of this an internal audit that is required by an external agency, again, as part of compliance with federal or international or local regulation or industry-wide regulation. Or you may be required to do this by the courts, for example. You may be engaged in a sort of internal audit in response to the demands of an external driver. The case that we just talked about, the Compass audit, was a paradigmatically external audit. It was an audit that was where the investigators had no internal access at all, but they could create an important kind of touchstone, a view in on the overall ways in which the algorithm worked, based solely upon information gathered from the outside. You have different kinds of that particular audit was looking at the outcomes, right, which was some seemingly unfair outcomes for people of different socioeconomic backgrounds, people of different racial backgrounds, some assumptions that the algorithm seemed to be making based on bigotry that existed already in the social structure. So kind of reinscribing the kinds of mistakes that that humans were already making and giving them the force of seemingly the seeming balance of a computational system. In that case, you were looking really at the outcomes, right? So another way we could split this is along the outcome versus process basis. And so, especially internal audits are often procedural audits, making sure that the governance systems are working as they're intended to, that you're complying with regulations, that things are being documented properly and archived properly. So internal audits often will align more directly with procedural sorts of specifications. I don't want to say outcomes because that confuses things a bit, but you'll be looking at the procedures that are being followed and how they're being implemented and that sort of thing. And external audits are often much more focused on outcomes, right? What is the result of the use of this? Of course, both can use both, but there tends to be a focus on the latter. And the last is this kind of static versus dynamic, right? So you might look at an audit during a particular period of time. You might look at it, as an outcome as part of a process. If this is demanded by a court case or something like that, it might be during a clearly bracketed time period. For a research study, often it's that as well. Or it might be something closer to a pipeline study. I participated a little bit on looking at, this was an internal and external, because at the time Twitter was engaging an external organization to look at questions of how well abusive stuff was being flagged and then handled, right? And so they had worked with an outside group to both assist with that process and to audit the process to make sure that it's fair. And that was not, there wasn't a clear start or end there. It was really looking, again, this was more procedural, but it was looking at whether that process was working the way it should work. And so they had data about, when something was flagged, how it was handled, and whether the handling of that flag data, both the moderation of it and the appropriate coding of it was happening according to procedures. But then it also took that outcome measure and said, okay, did this solve the problem? Was this, as an ongoing basis, solving the kind of problem that was seen as being a problem on Twitter? And so this is more of a dynamic process, something that is set up as an ongoing audit process. On the accounting side, you often have this sort of ongoing audit trail, right? This ongoing process of someone that is looking over procedures as they are happening and making sure that as an ongoing basis, you are adhering to the requirements and that potentially you're having the kinds of outcomes of those requirements that you're claiming. This is as opposed to something like a financial audit from a company that's going to acquire you, or an IRS audit, our favorite kind. So those are kind of the three ways we might be able to split up the types of audits. The big one being the internal versus external, or the external ones might be adversarial or not, but generally are somewhat adversarial because you just don't have access to the internal information. Procedural versus outcome-based, and dynamic versus static. So the method, how do you actually conduct this audit? If you're doing one of the ways you can do this, one of the things you can draw on is documentation and policy audits. So this is usually more on the internal side. And so, although there are some things that are accessible by those without special access, right? So in this case, you're largely looking at documentation and archival materials. So you might look at the terms of service. You might look at transparency reports. You might look at the content moderation guidelines, either the ones that are presented to the user or the ones that are presented to those engaged, if you have human coders, those who are engaged in the content moderation. These are, I think Facebook is the most famous example of the levels of secrecy with which they shared these content moderation guidelines, because they, in many cases, had outsourced this to external companies, but there were pretty extreme restrictions on making sure that those didn't get out to people who might be auditing that process. And also advertising sort of policy disclosure. So these are often sort of legal or semi-legal statements. You might actually be able to get access to some of the discussion over this in some cases, depending on the kind of organization. And, that gives you something to kind of work off of. It certainly can be a big part, even if it's not the totality of it, it can be a big part of it. So if you're looking at Facebook, for example, you have public documentation that says that you have neutral ad delivery, for example. But people have looked at that and realized that in fact that they were engaged in what in many contexts would be considered illegal discrimination in the ways in which they were delivering ads, particularly for employment ads, where there are restrictions on how much you can say. In this case, there was an external audit that looked at it and tested it and showed that Facebook was delivering employment ads to men more than women in many cases. And so if that's illegal under U.S. law, but you have to kind of, as part of your entire audit process, you do look and say, okay, well, are they saying that they're doing this? If not, that's one kind of piece of this, right? We need to look and see, how they describe their own processes as part of this. So, that gives us a sort of a baseline that we can then measure the actual outcomes if we look at the algorithm itself against. So part of this process is trying to figure out what the intent is, what the standards are, what the overall operational process is. And often these are documented both internally and externally. Neither of those may actually relate directly to actual system behavior. But we need to have those in place to know whether what we're measuring is a deviation from that standard, or whether it's doing what, even if it's not what we like, it's doing what is intended by the folks who are implementing the algorithm. More commonly, we're talking about sort of an input-output, you can look at output alone. That's kind of what Compass is. It kind of says it has to look at input somewhat, in that they have some information about the people who are being sentenced, perhaps the same amount of information that the judge has, but largely you're looking at outputs. But generally speaking, we treat the algorithm itself as a black box. We look at the inputs, we look at the outputs, and we try to, reverse engineer what's happening on the inside to a greater or lesser degree. Usually to a lesser degree, right? We're not trying to look so much at the details unless it's something that can be emergent from the input and output. But we're mostly looking to see whether it follows, again, the claims that it's making. So in the case of Facebook, you could post identical job ads, and you could do different kinds of targeting parameters and see whether it was disproportionately shown, like STEM ads were disproportionately shown to men rather than women. Without, obviously, for anyone who has placed ads in the Meta space, that you can do some pretty strict targeting of who you want to send ads to, but you shouldn't be getting the concomitant targeting towards protected classes. And so just because it's a STEM ad, if you you can't legally say, I only want this shown to men. You could probably get called up on if you try to narrowcast it to things you think that are men type things, like people who shave more often or something like that. It's going to be pretty transparent that you're trying to overcome the anti-discriminatory legislation and also policy at Facebook. But it turned out that even without doing all of that, simply placing a STEM ad showed up more often on profiles that listed themselves as being male than it did on profiles that listed themselves as being a woman or being female. So that's a problem. You can look at that's a kind of a binary experiment type thing, right? You can actually place the ads, make sure that they're being evenly distributed. Folks have tried to do the same kind of auditing around YouTube recommendations. Like, what is it that, in fact, showing that over time, looking at recommendation after recommendation and where people end up in that process. This is both on YouTube and Instagram and TikTok and a number of places, trying to, again, figure out I don't know that anyone's done it directly with, Netflix is an interesting example because they had a number of competitions where they opened up their data and asked people to help with the recommendation system. That's not exactly an external audit, but you can kind of compare that with what the actual recommendations end up being to figure out what Netflix's recommendation algorithm might look like. So you have things like recommendation algorithms where you can kind of look and see whether things are being recommended the way that you would expect them to be, or whether you can find some standardized trends around what gets recommended over time. There's a slight issue here around kind of these are highly dynamic systems, and so you really want to come up with something that you can show once you've developed a structure where you're making a claim. That's a lot easier with the male-female thing, but with the issue of describing the ways in which the algorithm works to make recommendations, ideally you should be able to then, once you've described that, demonstrate that it adheres to that algorithm. So it should be something, again, that is reliable and therefore replicable, that you can then put into place and say, okay, well, these researchers have found that this is the way the algorithm works. If I then look at the algorithm during a certain period, I should be able to see it working that way, basically. That it should be something that can be replicated through anyone in any place. This has implications for design. You need to make sure that you're not doing this from a position that the algorithm recognizes. So a lot of this is making sure that you are accessing from different places in different languages with different computers, for example. And that can raise a certain level of challenge here because you need that distributed anonymity, I guess, to effectively come up with some kind of a test. And this is especially hard when the something like a recommendation system is built on a long history of watching what you do, right? It has to do with profiles, and so you have to figure out if you can randomize those profiles in some way or link those profiles as inputs into certain outputs. And so that complexity makes doing this work somewhat complicated, at least. In my own area, one of the areas I've looked at quite a bit is search engines and how those algorithms might behave in different contexts. And so because of the power that something like Google means the search engine still used by 90% of users, the kind of power that exerts through its algorithm is extreme. And so understanding the ways in which that may skew results, either as a whole, that is, whether it systematically tends to favor certain kinds of things over certain other kinds of things, or whether it skews it so that certain people see only certain things, that kind of work can be pretty valuable as well. And so this might have to do, again, with lots of pieces of personalization you may not recognize, lots of localization you may not recognize. And so because it is such a complicated algorithm, understanding how it works and what biases might be revealed in how it works is really quite tricky. It would be much easier if we could just get a copy of what they're doing, but in many cases, I think there's a reason to suspect that many of the designers don't quite understand fully how these algorithms work. As they become more complicated, especially as they're using things like machine learning models, they are not just obscure to those on the outside, but can also be quite obscure to those who are working on them from the inside. So that internal-external thing gets broken down a bit. One of the sources we can use to do this is trace data, not just kind of directly interacting with the algorithm, but using traces that others have used, that others have produced in engaging with these algorithms. So you can do things like look at user profiles and how they've moved through a space. You can, again, request users to provide you with that tracking data with the kind of their click stream over time. So instead of generating these broad random collections, you can kind of you can ask for actual real users and get a sample of real users and how they've been affected by these algorithms. You can look at things like financial disclosures and agreements. You can look at things like worker logs and how people have worked on something, for example. And there's some work on gig work, for example. If you want to understand the bias in Uber's algorithm for how it assigns people to different jobs, you could kind of make use of the workers' own logs of how they've been able to work, given their backgrounds, for example. You can look at earnings records. You can look at financial records that have to be disclosed by a company to try to backtrack from there. You can look at leaving aside the user side. A lot of this stuff looks at advertising, and so there has to be accounting for the advertising side of this so that you know how much you owe to these companies for biasing things in the way that you want. And so just some of those may be discoverable in some way. And of course, you can interview people and talk to them about that process. Basically what you're trying to do is take this very opaque, this black box, and take off layers, at least in places where you can start to look at this. And often this requires not just a technological process, but also a social process of talking to the people who interact with it as well. This gets to this issue that this is a socio-technical system. And so to the degree to which you can talk to the other actors, some of those are machines, but some of them are people, both on the consumer side, if they're kind of at the tail end of getting impacted by or affected by these algorithms, but also to the degree that it's possible, those who work for a company or formerly worked for a company, or others who might be able to provide some kind of information that helps you to pull away that curtain. And I've talked about bringing people in and interviewing them, but you can go a step further than that and really engage in this more participatorily as well. That means things like talking to, say, YouTube creators about the ways in which their material may have been demonetized. This is a big issue for folks who are on YouTube, like what kinds of things lead to demonetization, and kind of talk about their life process. That is more of an interview, but you can actually get people engaged in like ongoing reporting, especially for dynamic stuff. So you can kind of see, one of the problems is that this, not only the algorithm is black box, but for things that are, for example, moderated out, you might not be able to get access to those immediately. And so you need the participation of those people who have had their stuff, their whole channel shut down on YouTube, or, their comment removed on whatever site. And that may disappear or be hard to uncover. But if you have participation from those who have been affected by this, you can get access to the stuff that's missing. And that isn't necessarily opening up this black box, but it's at least, again, revealing a piece of information that otherwise would be hidden in that process. It's great to see what comes through, but then you have to usually intuit what's been censored. And if you have access to the things that have actually been censored, that gives you a lot more to work with in terms of the output, the output of these algorithms. And so, so to get at this kind of these kind of tacit processes between sometimes the creators or the workers or the consumers of the stuff that is kind of coming in and out of that algorithm, kind of co-opting those people as informants and engaging in that can help you get a richer view of the ecosystem as a whole. Now, this is a very kind of difficult area to work in, and there are some significant challenges to it. One of these is that you have to make sure you're being careful about your metrics. This is a methodological problem throughout the whole process of doing methods, right? Your metrics really matter. And so while, when you say that whether a process is fair or not, you need to be pretty explicit about what that means. In the case of Compass, for example, what does fairness mean? Fairness means that when you look at two people and you see that they have similar educational backgrounds, similar arrest records, similar job records, similar kind of attachments to the community, and the only thing different about them seems to be their race or ethnicity, then you can start to make some inferences about that. But is that the kind of fairness is that what we mean by fairness, right? So you need to be very explicit about the kinds of metrics you're using, even when those who are producing the algorithm may not be, right? So part of the problem with some of the documentation is that it may be quite vague about the kinds of terms it's using and how it's measuring those terms, or how it might define those terms, but you need to be very clear about those definitions. And so that is at least a challenge. It's not something that is impossible, but it's something that you have to be very careful about being explicit and consistent in the way you use your metrics to see what's going on in terms of the inputs and outputs. A really big one here is, Google itself goes through what has colloquially called the Google dance, where every few months the algorithm changes. So, if you're doing an audit, that may be great for right now, but 3 or 4 or 5 months down the line, or 3 or 4 or 5 weeks down the line, you might have a materially different algorithm in play. It might be an incremental change, or it might be a complete reversal. And so and it won't. In many cases, in some cases it'll be obvious. In some cases it'll actually be announced. And in other cases, might be a subtle change that is very difficult to discern in the data you're collecting itself. So that instability over time is a significant challenge, both for dynamic ones, where you have to kind of perioditize this so that you're making sure that you're capturing the same thing over time, and for more stable static kinds of audits, where okay, this is a static audit during this period of time. Are we measuring the same algorithm during this entire period of time, right? So that becomes a challenge. You have to worry about kind of, I don't want to call it motivation, but there is kind of a tend towards, you have to wonder whether optimization is the same as bias, right? So, you may have something where there is explicit discrimination, but in many of these cases, the intent is not to discriminate. I don't think people sat down with Compass and said, let's get as many African American males behind bars as possible. I think there are people who assume that that's what happened, but I honestly don't think that is why it is a bias system. I don't think that when you search for black girls, this is, from a very famous study, that, when you search for black girls, that it leads to more pornography is the intent of Google. I don't think anybody in the Google engineering suite said, let's do this. Let's make sure that when people search for, any ethnicity plus girls, they get porn, but when they search for white plus girls, they don't. I don't think that was the intent. So because this is not necessarily, and I will say that by saying that, I'm also not saying the opposite, right? I'm not saying that it was not intended. That's because I think in some of these cases, these are thinly veiled intents of, the intention there is fairly thinly veiled, and it was the motivation, right? That this kind of discrimination of one type or another really is at the heart of what they're doing, right? So I don't want to discount that. I don't want to discount the fact that, that you didn't mean it doesn't mean it's true, not true, right? Because it clearly does. Just reinscribing existing social inequities is not an excuse, but it does introduce a difficult dynamic, right? So this gets to the question of, for example, the hiring question. So are more men hired as, let's take this home. It's not a good example. I was going to say, are more men hired as professors because men are better at professing? But the truth is that that's not right now in many fields the case, that actually more new hires that are in faculty in many fields are women. But let's just assume that men, certainly because of the age bias over time, there are more men in the professoriate than there are women getting PhDs, for example. Or a much clearer case here is there are more women graduates of law school and far, far fewer women who are, partners or managing partners at large law firms. And so you could say this is a large argument around income bias anyway, right? You could say that this is just an optimization problem. That the reason for this is that more women take time off during their first few years of being a lawyer, and that this sets them against the possibility of getting up to the higher ranks within a large law firm because they are too distracted by family. So this is a pretty common claim, not just in law, but in a lot of fields. And the problem is that so that would be kind of like an optimization problem, right? That the system isn't designed to sideline women in their first few years of being an attorney at a large firm, but that as a practical matter, that's what happens. And it's really hard to disentangle that from a glass ceiling that is not just that, but also clearly discriminatory, right? And so that's one of the challenges with all of this is figuring out how much of this is a problem because it is reinscribing existing systems, how much of it is a problem because it is intentionally doing this, how much is it a problem because of overlooking the possibility of that outcome. That you haven't done enough to check the likelihood of reinscribing existing systems. How much of it is a failure to resist those who have manipulated your algorithm? So, for example, Google faced this problem with a website that was produced by a racist group that provided a biography of Martin Luther King. And if you search for Martin Luther King on Google, your first hit would be a racist diatribe against MLK. And it wasn't there because it was the most accurate response. And it wasn't there for a bunch of other reasons. It was there because they had successfully kind of reverse engineered the algorithm and moved themselves up to the top of the ranks. So especially in systems like that, some of the bias that's the output of the bias is because actors within the ecosystem have figured out how to work that system as well. So all of these are questions of how you kind of make sense of the input-output model that you have used to kind of thresh out this system. So I'll kind of close this out by going back to the beginning here. So why are we auditing? As social scientists, we audit because understanding large socio-technical systems is at the core of what a lot of us do, right? We want to understand how these systems work, and systems that have opaque algorithms make that process even harder than it would be if it were entirely transparent. So we audit because we have to, right? And one of the largest challenges for doing this kind of work is frankly a legal one. Christian Sandvig and some other researchers, but he was the one who ended up suing Facebook over it, wanted to look at some of the things that we've started to talk about. Others have it afterwards as well. ProPublica has, and some researchers at Princeton have as well, about this both racial and gender bias in the way that ads are served on Facebook. And the terms of service of Facebook have a bunch of restrictions on things that would help you to do these kinds of forensic investigations. For example, you're not allowed to set up fake users. You're not allowed to pretend to be accessing from somewhere else. You're not allowed to collect data that would allow you to understand how that works, how the algorithm works. And the problem is in the United States, thanks to a law here that has been around since the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, violating terms of service is one of the most penalty-prone kinds of activities you can engage in. You can go to jail for years and years for doing so. You can go to jail for 5 years for violating what you may not have read when you went on. You don't even have to click through on many sites. Effectively, you have to go find those terms of service, and if you violate them, it's not just that you've like broken a contract with Facebook and they don't have to work with you anymore, or they'll kick you off, or they'll ban you. You can be arrested and go to jail for this. And so Sandvig brought this all the way to the Supreme Court or all the way up to the federal court. I think I don't know that it got taken up by the Supreme Court. It got decided at the highest courts with the help of the ACLU to give kind of some space for this to open up. And others have done the same and have gone through the court process to say, okay, this is clearly a system that makes the secrecy of algorithms punishable by state violence, and that's pretty extreme. We need to find some space for people doing this work. And you've seen some of this also in things like the Association for Computing Machinery's ethics guidelines, which formerly and still does encourage you to follow terms of service, but they now kind of carve out this space to say, well, sometimes you have to violate those terms of service if you can articulate a higher ethical aim here. If you're engaging in the system ethically, but violating those terms of service, that may still be ethical from the perspective of from an organization that is of computer professionals. Anyway, so this is another challenge you have to keep in mind, that when you engage in this stuff, it's really hard to do while adhering to the regulations established by the platform or by the algorithm owner. And because of that, often you are running afoul of not just those regulations, but of the law. And this is not unusual, especially for journalists and also for academics, to kind of engage in work that may be more important than the law and therefore skip at the edges of the law. But it is definitely a challenge in this area when you are running up against terms, where the algorithm owners get to make up the rules of the game, and that they're enforced by someone with a very large bat behind them. And so, leaving aside the do you really want to have Facebook or Meta angry at you? And yes, in my case, yes, that would be great. Please be angry at me. But leaving aside that piece, do you want to spend 5 or 10 or 15 years in jail because you've done an algorithmic audit? And I'm guessing that for most people, that answer is a very hard no. So this kind of the legal ground here is another piece of this. You have both the ethical questions, but you also have some pretty significant legal questions about what you can access, how you can access this, and how you can analyze it when the rules around that are being dictated by someone else. So again, we'll kind of circle this back to what we started with, was why do all of this? And, as a social scientist, the reason we do this is because, if you want to know about, large socio-technical systems, algorithmic processes are a huge part of that now. They've always been, but I think they're a large and growing part of that, especially as things that are under the wide rubric of AI come in. I think a lot of those are a lot of what we call AI now have been algorithmic systems all along, but it seems that as they are taking on that larger role, AI provides some way of kind of personifying that algorithmic process. And so uncovering, if you're trying to figure out this ecology, having a black box there that you have no way of opening or figuring out is a challenge, right? It kind of messes with your process. And so as a social scientist, we want to open up that black box and figure out what kinds of effects it's having and whether those are something that can be, adapted or rejected or regulated. That's kind of part of our role. But more broadly, as a democracy, democracies thrive on transparent processes, especially when it comes to the imposition of power. And so, there's a reason that journalists, especially data journalists, are deeply involved in these kinds of auditing processes. And that is that, if you want to have a system that is fair, and a democratic system is intended to provide power to the people, to the demos, that transparency is essential. And so, this is not just true of kind of political democracy, but our everyday lives as democratic processes, our economic lives as democratic processes. Are we able to shape the ways in which we interact with each other? Economies, good capitalist economies rely on that kind of transparency as well. Transparency of pricing, of contracts, that kind of thing. And as those become algorithmically shaped, as your airline ticket depends on who you are, your history of flying, what you posted on Facebook last week. As pricing now is dynamic, as jobs are dynamic, you might get paid differently depending on what you posted or depending on where you've been in the last week. All of these become quote unquote dynamic. What that means is that decisions around them are being made and often made by a computer and not by a person. So they're beyond the kind of what we do here as social scientists. There is a broader social demand for accountability. And that accountability can only happen through auditing. And so what we do, we need to learn how to audit these better, both for our own methodology, but also because we need to hand those tools over to others who have other reasons to want to know how these algorithms are working. So I think there's an imperative beyond the methodological imperative to engaging in opening up black boxes.